Hey, history scholars, it is Miss Gooding, and I wanted to begin today talking about Jamestown. Jamestown was established 1607. It was actually the very first successful English colony in the New World. As you know, there were a couple of attempted establishments before Jamestown, and one of them was Roanoke, which I mentioned in one of the previous videos. But this was an English colony established by the London Company. And the London Company was basically established by King James I. And his intention with settling in the New World and trying to get a settlement here was to make money. And so that is what they ended up doing. So, a little bit more background on Jamestown. Do remember also that this is all about glory, gold, and God. Okay, this is, we have settlers that are coming over here eventually that are going to be settling here for freedom of religion. And that's going to be happening, right after basically Jamestown is successful and the word gets back to England. But really, they are looking for riches. And the London Company definitely does that once they get things going here in the United States. So December 6th of 1606, there were about 104 men and boys who sailed from England to start this colony under, with James the First's blessing. They landed in the New World, and they, of course, named Jamestown after King James. So what happened is there were several different problems at the very beginning that almost did in Jamestown. First of all, they sent the wrong type of people. For a new colony, you would assume that they would send farmers and engineers and builders and things like that. But this group was a bunch of fairly well-off, rich individuals, and so they were really not very effective in doing the things that needed to be done. Secondly, they settled really in a poor spot. In a second, I'm going to show you a map, but Jamestown is a very swampy area. It was humid. It was infested with mosquitoes and different bugs and just gross. So, and it was also kind of hard to farm. And then lastly, no one was in charge. So you have a group of probably highly intelligent men and people that are willing to, put their due diligence in. But they're not trained in what they need to be trained. And in addition, nobody was in charge. So those were kind of some problems that they had to overcome. This all changed in 1608 when John Smith came about, and he came to Jamestown, and basically he established a new policy. And this new policy really was to spur people on. Basically, he said, if you don't work, you don't eat. And so he lit a fire. He put people to work. He was able to motivate people. He was able to direct people in order to get things done. And really, they then respected him. And so they did. They listened to him, and he was the leader that they needed at this point in time. He had a brief relationship with Pocahontas. Pocahontas was the daughter of the chief of the Powhatan tribe. And so that was fairly short lived because the Queen of England eventually called John Smith back. I'm sure that she probably sent him on more expeditions because he was so talented. And so anyway, then the settlers were there again by themselves without that strong leader. And so the winter of 1609 and 1610 was excruciating for these people. Historians call this the starving time, and it was terrible. They ended up, I think, at the very beginning of the winter, they had something like 550 settlers. And by the end of the winter, they had like 60 to 65 people still alive. And so they went through a terrible, terrible time. Luckily, And by the way, they were actually planning to journey back across the Atlantic, back to England because they had almost given up. But in the spring of 1610, they were saved by supply ships. So supply ships had been sent, and this really enabled them to survive a little bit longer. Obviously, um, they did have to fare some attacks by the Powhatan tribe, though. In 1611, 1612, actually through 1614, Jamestown was continually attacked by Native Americans, specifically the Powhatan tribe. And so there was a lot of raids going back and forth. So local Indians would raid Jamestown. Jamestown would then raid back. So it was an uncomfortable situation for a lot of them. And we'll get back to the Native American kind of relationships, obviously, on and off throughout this early colonial time period. But here's the map that I promised you. You can see here, looking at my cursor here, is Jamestown. Again, a very swampy, humid kind of area. But you'll see just kind of how it then spread out. Okay, so I want to talk about how Jamestown actually became successful after all the many years of kind of ups and downs that they faced. So Jamestown was able to establish a cash crop. And this cash crop was tobacco, and I provided a picture of tobacco up here in case you've never seen it, before it has been harvested and dried. But they established a cash crop, the tobacco. It was, drugs sell well, unfortunately, and so they definitely thought that this would be a good option for them. John Rolfe was a newcomer to Jamestown. He was experienced with tobacco, and he started to experiment with tobacco. He wanted to make sure that it was even more sellable than previously, and so he devised a type of tobacco that was not quite as harsh. And once he was able to do that, he ended up being able to sell it not only back to England but to the settlers as well. He definitely made money, so that was definitely something that helped Jamestown survive. He also married Pocahontas, and while he was married to Pocahontas, there was relative peace for an extended amount of time in between the Native American tribe and the settlers. Obviously, the Powhatan tribe, the chief, the father of Pocahontas, did not want her to be injured or killed in any of the raids, and so they really held off, and there was more of a collaborative effort between the two groups. So that was another reason that Jamestown was able to be successful. So this helped the overall reputation of Jamestown back in England, but a local government was established, and they established in 1619 the House of Burgesses. And the House of Burgesses lasted really quite a while until our Constitution was written. But the House of Burgesses gave people a way to make decisions, make laws, just kind of a structure to the society. And they were able then to send word back to England, communicate with the king about their needs. And they were very successful with this. Along with that, the colony of Jamestown and Virginia, actually, at this point in time, they had named it Virginia. The Virginia wanted to become a royal colony. And actually, James the First made it a royal colony in exchange for basically protection. So that also helped things as well. The company basically would turn over profits, and then the king in exchange would offer security from the Royal Navy, etc. So if you remember in one of the previous videos that I created, that there are three types of colonies. There is the royal colony, governed by a royalty, a corporate colony owned by a business of some sort, and then there's a proprietary colony, and that is owned by a very wealthy individual. So So basically, Jamestown went from a complete failure or near failure to a colony that was a resounding success. And those are some of the reasons why. So why is this successful? Oh wait, I forgot. Okay, so 1624. Yep. Covered all that. Recruitment of indent. Oh, okay. I forgot to mention this. This is really important. Um, Another reason that Jamestown became successful is because they recruited people to be able to work, and the establishment of the House of Burgesses made the colony really reputable over in England. And so, what the colonists did is they started sending for indentured servants, and what that meant is that um, they would pay for an English person to come over to the colony, and they would pay their way, and then that person would then work for them for 3 to 7 years. And after that 3 to 7 years, they would then be released, and sometimes they would gain livestock or land or something like that to get a start. So basically, people were using the system in order to come to the New World if they didn't have a lot of money in order to travel over here on their own. So that gave people kind of some free labor. And then another thing that started to happen was in 1619, the first Africans were brought to Jamestown. And at this point in time, what you need to understand is in 1619, Africans were treated as indentured servants. And that definitely changed. And I'll get to that slide in just a second. So why is Jamestown significant? Jamestown is significant because by the time the American Revolution rolled around, Virginia was a very, very successful company or colony. It was the wealthiest, it was the strongest, it was the most organized, it was progressive, and the first handful of presidents actually came from Virginia. So they were a leader, and their strong foothold in the New World, the House of Burgesses being located there, some of the very first leaders being from Virginia really propelled them to being a leader through the entire colonization of the New World. Okay, back to slavery. So, slavery in the colonies. The first Africans were brought to the colonies in 1619, like I mentioned. The slavery system did change over time. At first, Africans were treated as indentured servants. They were given their freedom after a certain amount of time, after whatever their contract had said. But over time, the contracts became longer and longer. The contract language changed. They began to be called property, and then in addition to being called property, the slaves then children became the owner's property, and all of those things were put into contracts. So the case for slavery is that it evolved over time. And it became this horrible inhumane machine that some in the United States relied upon heavily. And we will definitely be talking about slavery a lot in this course. So, a very interesting thing occurred. Okay, well, I have to back up. So, conflicts with Native Americans. The book and the videos that I'm going to have you watch are much more detailed, but this is a list of some of the conflicts, the main ones with Native Americans and white settlers. So, there was the Anglo-Powhatan War. There were two of them. And then I'm going to let you kind of look at these on your own. But the with Native Americans was just something that came up over and over and over, and it did tend to weaken, the settlers' ability to stabilize themselves. One of the things, and the reason that this did happen, is because um, the cash crop, tobacco, is incredibly tough on the land, and it drains the soil of nutrients. And so, as they used up the nutrients, they needed to move further and further west, and they started to encroach upon Indian land, and Native Americans were definitely not happy with that, because along with this newly farmed land and more tobacco came livestock, and sometimes these livestock would venture in, would eat Native American crops and destroy things. And so there was definitely a cultural conflict there. So this all leads us to Bacon's Rebellion. And for a second, you're going to be like, what is the connection, Miss Gideon? I don't get it. But Bacon's Rebellion took place in 1676. Basically, a little bit about Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon was an English guy. He was educated at Cambridge, so he wasn't an unintelligent person, but he came over to the colonies as an indentured servant. And a little bit about indentured servitude. The headright system was established because people would be, if people brought indentured servants in, farmers or whoever they may be, the headright system was a way to reward them. So they would be given money in order to bring people over. And so this was a really attractive thing for fairly well-off individuals to do. But oftentimes, these indentured servants were worked extremely hard. And oftentimes after their 7 years or whatever they decided to work for their passage over, they either were sickly at the very end, some of them died, and then some of them did not get the land or the resources that they were promised. And so a lot of these individuals that were freemen, ended up living on the very outskirts of quote unquote civilization. And so they were more often attacked by Native American tribes during these raids. And so Nathaniel Bacon, some Africans, some poor farmers, and some other people got together, and they were very frustrated with how things were for them. I mean, gosh, you guys, there were hardly any women. These guys didn't have land. They were poor. They had been, shuffled over here from England, a lot of them, and they just were frustrated with life. And so they went to the governor of Virginia, Governor Berkeley. Oops, there should be an E right here. My apologies. But Berkeley, for help and protection. Now, Berkeley kind of ignored them. And the reason is because he wanted to be fair to the Native Americans. He wanted to be true to the treaties that were established. And he just didn't think it was a good idea to kind of ruffle those relationships with Native Americans, especially for trade purposes. So what does Bacon do? He leads an attack on Native Americans. And that doesn't really go over so well. He then goes back and he attacks Jamestown. He and the group of people attack Jamestown. They pillage, they burn. Basically, it's just kind of a rebellious riot. And obviously, this really upset Berkeley. So Berkeley, Nathaniel Bacon died of, I think it was, some disease. Was it dysentery? Something like that. But anyways, he he died, but then Berkeley hanged a whole bunch of people that were a part of this rebellion. They were so quickly defeated by the Royal Army and the Royal Navy that they really didn't have a chance once they started to attack Jamestown to do anything other than just riot and stuff. So their point was made, but it didn't work out well. But the important, so why is Bacon's Rebellion important? So listen up. This is why it's important. Bacon's Rebellion showed leaders like Berkeley how powerful and violent, poor, marginalized, landless people could be. And they also realized that indentured servitude, might not be such a great thing for some white folks. This is where we get a transition to slavery. Instead of, having whites band together and whites rising up against the government, which was really what Bacon's rebellion largely was. They wanted to end indentured servitude and implement African slavery. And there was the triangle trade was up and running at this point in time, and this would have been a fairly easy transition to make for them. And so that is what started to happen after Bacon's rebellion.